Hey everybody, hopefully we're live here. This is Mark Coxon. I am your moderator for the Modern AV UX panel, and I appreciate you all joining me today. I wanted to say that I'm super excited for a couple reasons. Number one, because I have my new Shure Aonic headphones, which great gift. Thanks so much, Shure, for facilitating that for us here today. But also because I think we have a great panel. And the reason I think the panel is so great is because of some of the diversity, not only of the people, but of the actual roles that they play in our industry. And, you know, many times we get perspectives from manufacturers or from integrators or from consultants, but not all together with the end users that actually use the systems. And I think it really provides us with an opportunity to have a holistic conversation today that goes from end to end and really takes in a bunch of unique perspectives. So with that, I'm going to introduce my panel. So first off, I have Charmaine Torruella, and Charmaine is a GMS account manager for a company called Verrex. How are you, Charmaine?
I am doing well, thank you, Mark.
Awesome. We also have Dana Schneider. Dana is a senior analyst and project manager for Edwards Lifesciences. How are you, Dana?
Hey, Mark, I'm good. How are you?
Good. Michael Judeh. Michael Judeh is a senior director of AV technology at Convene. How are you, Michael?
Good, Mark. Thanks for having me.
And last but not least, we have Sean Reid, and Sean is the founder of Astroman AV, which is an AV consultancy firm. How are you, Sean?
Excellent. Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So not only was this a good way for me to introduce everybody, but it was a good way to make sure that everybody knows how to come off of mute. So with that, I want to kick off our panel today. You know, there are a ton of abbreviations in the AV industry. We're guilty of using them all the time. And UX is an abbreviation. And for those of you who don't know what UX is the user experience. And it's slightly different than UI, which is just the user interface, which a lot of us are familiar with. And I wanted to make that differentiation because I think a lot of us as AV people or as technology people understand the concept of a user interface needing to be intuitive and discoverable and reliable and convenient, all of those things. So with that, I really wanted to tap the panel as to what their definition of UX is or what it means to them. Because I think it'll give us a good base for the rest of the conversation. So in the order of my introductions, I guess I'll start with Charmaine. Charmaine, what does UX mean to you?
Getting off mute, so.
There she is.
There I am, I found it. So UX means to me, it's, you know, basically we know it stands for user experience, but, you know, a valuable UX or user experience is not just tying a solution to the experience, but also a feeling. You want to make sure that the user has a good attitude, feeling about whatever it is you're going to provide them. So if you could promote that with the user experience, that makes it even better.
I love that. I love the idea of the feeling and promoting the feeling within the user. And I know, Dana, you're in charge of a very large, you know, multinational company as far as helping set AV standards. As far as you're concerned with user experience, what does that mean to you when you're deploying that?
So similar to what Charmaine said in terms of the overall experience, I want it to be seamless. I don't want my end users to experience any difficulties signing into technology. I don't want them to not understand what they're using. It has to be seamless, it has to be user-friendly, and it has to make their life easier, because at the end of the day, our end user is trying to get in there to have that meeting that could be critical for, you know, their day-to-day business. So I don't want anything on their mind in terms of like a bad experience from technology. So,
great. Michael, you are a AV technology director for Convene, which is kind of like a a hosted office solution for businesses that need that. How do you think of UX?
UX, yeah, definitely. I think UX for me is twofold. There's the customer-facing user experience, but then there's the operator technician user experience that you have to consider. And so while we look to make things seamless, a lot goes into making things seamless, and a lot of engineering and a lot of potential complications as well. So with a full service support staff, we really consider what their user experience looks like as well, because they're the ones who interact with it, have to live and breathe it, and ultimately own it and support it at the end of the day. So we deep dive into the user experience, and it's not just the customer facing user experience and ease of use and function, but how can we support it? How can we maintain it? How can we refresh it? So it's more of a holistic view versus just the client facing side of things.
Yeah. And Sean, from your perspective, I mean, you're pretty much a coach for, end users as a consultant. You're helping them try to form this idea of what their systems should look like. What type of questions and considerations about the UX do you try to get people to consider when you're doing your designs?
Well, I work with integrators as well as end users, so I get to see it from both sides.
Sure.
When it comes to UX, for sure, there's, as Michael said, it's twofold from my perspective. There is the user's actual experience, and then there's actually still the design of it, which is either, if you're working with the end clients, their branding, how they want to interact with the user, versus as a designer or engineer, when I'm designing it for end user, how I want them to walk away saying, Astroman did this for us. So for me, it is, to go back to what Charmaine says, about a feeling. Are you happy with your work product at the end of the day? As an engineer, a programmer, an installer, when you go home and you sit down at the end of a long day, do you say, did I provide the best experience for my client? And are they happy with what I gave them? And at the same time, is the product something that's usable? I think we've all seen UX that works really well and some that work really bad. So always looking to improve is a big thing. Always looking to look at the next step ahead. Not always chasing after what's the newest technology, but looking to sometimes even improve on something that's tried and true, and how we can not necessarily reinvent the wheel, but use the wheel better. So whether that be an occupancy sensor and using it to control things like temperature and LED requirements, or even ADA requirements, versus trying to say, hey, someone's got a new touch panel and I can put it here or there. Simple little things that really make a user experience much more tactile and much more personal. Because at the end of the day, user experience is personal for the person using it. How well does it function, and makes them want to come back and use it again. If a huddle room or conference room is not functional, if a person can't walk up and use it, then the UX has failed, period. If you have to explain it, then you failed.
Yeah, I find that an interesting thing, because I think we're all attached to our laminated instruction sheets, right? And we feel like as long as we've provided that laminated instruction sheet, then the user should be able to do it. And one of the phrases that I hate the most in the AV industry is finger trouble. A lot of times we blame clients for systems that don't work, instead of looking at, maybe how we made that more seamless. So with that as a segue, in this new hybrid working environment where we don't control every device that somebody's touching, if they're at home or if they're somewhere else in this work from anywhere, and even to pull in one of the questions from the chat, when we're talking about this virtual user experience we have now between different locations, how do we best create a consistent experience across our locations? What are some considerations that kind of go into bringing forward that standard? And I'll start this time with Dana.
So the main thing is kind of looking at our history of what has worked in the past for our end users and technology that has been accepted within our culture, and then also looking at it from a global perspective of how we can scale this into our larger facilities globally. And at the end of the day, just getting that end user feedback as well for what their experience was, and seeing what's out there, what's coming down the pipeline in technology, and seeing how we can potentially integrate that into the future, and kind of staying 2 steps ahead in a sense, like thinking when we're integrating new technology, is this going to be outdated in a few years, or is this something that we can build on in the future?
Yeah, that idea of momentum, of what people are already comfortable with using, and making sure that you're leveraging that. When you guys are designing spaces, Michael, since you have people that are coming from multiple different companies and regions and coming into your spaces, how are you taking a look at bridging that gap between kind of spaces that are flexible and spaces that are reliable? Because I think sometimes those are at odds, right? If we make a space completely flexible where anybody can use any device, then we also may decrease the reliability. How do you balance those two things?
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's a challenge for us as a flexible workplace provider, because you may have a floor that's comprised of 4 or 5 different types of end users and enterprise customers, all with a different definition of what ideal user experience is. And I think even in the context of a singular enterprise, when you have several business units across that enterprise, they may have their own definitions of what ideal user experience is. And now in these larger organizations, there seems to be more of a push away from standardization on tools, and it's a pick your own adventure based on your specific team's needs or applications. And that is always going to affect the user experience, the technology that they're using, that specific technology, and how it interfaces with the room itself. So it's been a challenge, and I think we've learned a lot. And with user experience, you don't know until you know. And you know when you've deployed it and you've put it through its paces. I think I saw a comment of like, the customer should set their expectations around what user experience is, but that's an expectation that's delivered in a vacuum without any sort of context to it. And so you can't marry that until you have the real world application, and then you have that experience that informs your process moving forward. Like Dana said, is just taking lessons learned from previous experiences, previous customers, and then amalgamating that in hope. And I think whenever you deploy a user experience, I think there's always a fingers crossed moment that this is going to be as good as it is when people actually start using it.
Sean, given what Michael said, that, and with this comment that the user should define the user experience, I completely 100% agree, given that we're already talking about things like feelings and perception, right? We're already going to these soft parameters of what a user experience really is, or that it promotes a feeling within someone. How do you guide that? I guess, how do you guide that discovery process? How do you go in and talk to someone and listen to what they're expecting something to do, and then help them, I guess, tailor that expectation to what the technology is capable of? I mean, what's that process look like for you?
I could give so many different examples of good and bad experiences with that. I'll give an example of a bad experience first, because I think we learn more from the bad experiences than we do from the good ones. When we execute a project perfectly, we feel really good about ourselves. When a project goes badly, regardless of whose fault or what happened, if we don't walk away having learned significantly on how to improve our own internal processes, we haven't learned anything. So I did a project here locally for the university. It's a divisible room. On paper, on spec, simple, divisible room. And it ended up being an utter nightmare from start to finish. Reflective ceiling plan was completely wrong. There were things in the ceiling no one knew. The general contractor didn't want to move things. There were ducts in walls no one knew about. Custom built furniture that didn't show up on time. Then when it did show up, it was 3 inches too big to fit in the space. It was a disaster from start to finish. And then on top of that, you had the bureaucracy of the school, where the IT department wanted one thing, and then the communications department wanted another thing. And you sit back and go, well, who was the consultant who designed this? And did they not sit down and talk to you people about what you wanted? And everyone said, no one talked to us. The school just purchased the design from someone who remained nameless and hired someone else to install it, and then hired me to come in and make it work. And so I was able to kind of, at the very end, point out, okay, here's all the things that went wrong well before I was involved. Here's how you can improve that process going forward. You need to talk to you, and you need to talk to you at this stage. And then, they were very grateful for that, because it wasn't about judgment. It was about, okay, now you see you have a system you don't like. The experience is horrible. The interfaces are horrible. But you now know for the next 3-4 projects you have planned to stop and do these things to make sure they're executed properly. And they actually were able to develop like 6 or 7 very specific standards from just one meeting going forward, which now improves all future AV products, which is important. If you're not learning, you're not growing. On the good side, when things go well, I had a project maybe 3-4 years ago where it was a corporate project, and someone needed their touch panels being 3 separate languages. And for all the linguists in the room, you'll probably appreciate the story. So they needed it in English, French, and in Mandarin. And for those who don't understand, there's between Western languages and more older languages, they read from right to left, for up and down. Getting that GUI to function on a fly, changing, was very difficult. That was probably the biggest thing. But having someone like yourself who speaks 7 languages come in and say, hey, I can find a way to tweak with this to make it work, and realize your GUI is going to change from language to language. So it flows better because there's a cultural understanding of it. There's a function and use case you have to really get your mind wrapped around, and sitting down with the 3 separate teams and really understanding what their individual needs were for that thing to work, and realizing they did not need one system. They really needed 3 systems, and trying to distill that down to something functional. While difficult, just having the conversation provided them with a product they loved in the end. User experience, we keep saying personal, but it's a high school science project. you want to do your best at it, but at the same time, you want to hand it off and walk away from it at some point, because you could sit there playing with it indefinitely. And AV, as we are all lovers of technology, we tend to get really tactile and really tunnel visioned and sit there and tweak with the project till we're happy with it, not realizing that the client's bar for happiness is way back here, and we're just perpetually jumping over hoops to say, oh no, I could do this now. It's important to reel ourselves in as designers and engineers and lovers of this technology and realize that sometimes the bar of happiness and completion for our clients is much lower than our own. And that though we know we can do better, sometimes doing better isn't always the best thing. Are we delivering what our clients want and need? Or are we, being mad scientists sitting there trying to just create the next coolest thing? So yeah, it's about really looking at each situation and really asking the hard questions and being able to have those difficult conversations with the end user on what they really want out of it. So you don't end up handing them this patchwork camel that does nothing that they want, but looks really cool and costs them a lot of money.
Charmaine, this reminds me, because I follow you and I like to read some things that you write, but this reminds me a lot of a blog you just wrote about We Need to Talk. And you kind of dove into, as technology people, we need to kind of widen our perspective of who the influencers in a project are. Can you talk us through a little bit about kind of what Sean was just saying about really getting the people to the table that make a difference in these user experiences?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, one big thing, I like keeping it simple. I saw someone in the chat say, keep it simple, right? That's what it's about. It's really keeping it simple. You have to think in perspective as you as a customer, right? In an enterprise. So you have to be properly engaged. It's all about how do you properly engage with the client to promote the user experience. So what do you have to understand? You have to understand that within a client organization, there's the user, there's the team that makes the decisions for the users, and then you have to determine, does that team actually know what those users are looking for in their experience? Many times we implement things that a shared services team or a technology team says, oh yeah, we think this will be great. But that team didn't necessarily go to their user and say, okay, do they really want video? Do they like audio? You have to have that conversation, that kind of engagement, a deep engagement. It's like being a Dr. Phil in technology, having them sit on that couch and really saying, okay, we have to engage in a deeper way. Technology team, does your user like to use video? How do they work, right? That has to be figured out first and foremost, because until you know that information, you're not going to understand how to satisfy that feeling, that user experience. It's all about that feeling. A shared services team many times can implement something like Sean said, be mad scientist, and then the users barely use it. I've done that, dealt with clients where they're like, oh, that's great. We spent millions of dollars on this solution, but you don't really use it. So can you come in and decom it? And it's like, wow, that was a lot of money you threw out the window. So that is the most important thing, engaging not only with the technology team for the organization, but making sure if they're not engaged with the users, that you somehow get that engagement to understand their workflow, to understand the feeling they want, the kind of ease they want out of the solution, as well as the function.
Totally. Given all this, Michael, we're talking a lot about getting this input from users. So let's say we do this properly. Let's say we take, Dana's advice and Michael's advice and Charmaine and Sean's advice, and we've gone through this process and we've leveraged these things properly and we put together a system. How are we gauging the success of our user experience? Is it the adoption of the technology? Is it the amount of support requests? Is it, for you, Michael, is it the amount of times people come back and rent your spaces again? I mean, how do we judge whether we're actually delivering a good user experience, and what are some best practices to determining that? Are you doing surveys or tracking tickets or things like that?
Yeah, I mean, for us, with our customers, it's a pulse check via like NPS surveys and things like that, right? It's interesting because data is like a big topic in data collection and analytics, but we never really talk about how we're analyzing and purposing that data. And numbers are great, but numbers can tell a lot of different stories. They're not like hard and fast and true rules. So I don't know if those necessarily dictate how valuable like user experiences are, and if those can be used as KPIs to measure like the quality of like a user experience. I think ultimately the best way to measure user experience is having conversations with the end user and polling a large enough sample size that you have sort of a control group, if we're looking at this purely scientifically, that you can measure against, and then sort of iterating that and doing that over time as well and seeing how that changes. Because adopting new technology, and we can make things as easy as we want, but maybe it just takes a little bit of time. I mean, if I were to buy an Android device over years of having an iPhone, it'd probably take me a few days or a few weeks to get used to it, even though it's probably like a great user experience or a great UI that people have spent a lot of time developing. So I think it's worth doing pulse checks, but consistent pulse checks over certain intervals as people's work methodologies evolve as well, and their specific needs out of each room evolves.
Sean, for you as a consultant, how do you double back and make sure that the user experience you designed is the one that is actually being experienced by the users?
I'm a little more old-fashioned. I don't collect as much data as much as direct interaction. I will call my clients. Most of my clients check in regularly with me. I'm known for asking a ton of questions that seem innocuous or excessive at the beginning of a project until 3 months later, I'm like, oh, by that way, that little thing you mentioned, guess what happened? Okay. Well, that's why you paid me. We need to be better about asking questions. I mean, really, in design of anything, whether it's your interior designer, an architect, even a car mechanic, ask questions. You never know what little piece of information will help you later in making a critical decision. Small things can become big things, from room size capacity and deciding what ALS system to use, to network security questions, which you could go down a whole separate rabbit hole about. So for me, it's about usually preparing questions. I'm very good at drafting documents that ask a ton of questions. I try to keep them under 32 is my magic number. 33 is my favorite number. So, and then, whittling them down as they get answered and cleared up, so that I have a set of notes to always refer back to. If there's ever an issue, the client says, well, we wanted this. And I say, well, I have this question I asked you 6 months ago, and you said X. We implemented X and it was fine. Now you're saying you want Y. That's great. We can change it. But when the question was asked, and there was a reason the question was asked. So going back to how you use data, if you have 100 clients and 99 of them are happy with your solution, you're constantly deploying. One client has a problem every time with the same part of it, doesn't mean you have a bad solution, but you may not be listening to that client particularly well, and they might have something they need, or that client just may be hard to satisfy. But you don't let the exception become the rule. So for me, how you use that data is really coalescing your design, your project management, your programming, whatever division of AV you're working in, around a consensus of what works, and then tailoring solutions for those clients that it doesn't work for, and also recognizing where sometimes your solution is well designed, but may not be a perfect fit, and either picking your clients better or be able to describe why your solution is the best fit for them. Those are really those hard discussions we have to have with our clients. We all see, from the small client to the big client. There's sometimes just clients you can't satisfy. And I'm sure you're not the only vendor of theirs that they call up at 3 in the morning complaining about something. There's a question in the Q&A I thought we should get to, what are some of the hurdles found in providing virtual UX, and this ties into that, which is one of the biggest hurdles in designing virtual UX is that a lot of people don't know how they're going to have a virtual UX, whether it be education or healthcare. They don't know how they want to interact with their end users anymore. And that user experience is hard to define when you yourself don't know whether your business will be around next year, whether it's worth investing in, or whether you have a service or a business that can provide a virtual UX. So it's not just what are the hurdles. Once again, it gets back to asking those questions of the client. Are you sure you can function with a virtual UX? You may not be able to. You can't have a virtual UX and have a coffee shop. I can't email you a cup of coffee. So when a client says, hey, I've got a chain of coffee shops and I want to design this so they can have a better payment portal, it's like, well, then you need to design a better website. You're not having an AV question. That's a website question. Talk to your web designer. If you're talking about education, telemedicine, even courts, you're seeing a place where they actually have to have this direct interaction, really pick up the pieces and say, is our infrastructure working or not? And those are the real hurdles, making sure people understand the question rather than looking for the answer.
I want to keep this as interactive and free-flowing and give as much value to the participants as possible. So I'm pushing into the Q&A, and there were actually a couple of questions here specifically for Dana. And I think, maybe we can round the table with them. But Dana, since they're addressed to you, maybe you can start. The questions pretty much would be twofold. Within your organization, when you're looking at, the user experience and designing AV for your users, number one, who's driving those designs? Is it your team, or are you relying on your vendors to drive designs and then you're kind of vetting them? And then number two, the second part of this was really, how are you creating a coalition or an alliance with your internal stakeholders so that there's trust that what you're delivering is something that they're going to be able to use and adopt, and that you have kind of their long-term best interest in mind, as opposed to, you know, making decisions based on budget and ease of use?
So in terms of basically making sure that we're putting in the right solution and working and partnering with the key internal stakeholders, where, like Michael said, it's also thinking about the AV support team who's supporting the equipment and their, you know, experience with the amount of calls that are coming in, and, you know, is that solution actually working? And then talking to the key stakeholders who are actually using the room, and similar to what Sean said, making sure to ask all those questions up front with all the different groups, whether it's the networking team, whether it's, you know, IT, whether it's the AV support team, or the key people using the room and end users. And then also kind of just checking in, you know, with the different groups and saying, hey, you know, you've been using this room for 4 months now. How has that experience been? What do you like? What do you not like? How can we simplify this? Or was there something that, you know, when we thought about the solution, did we build it where it was flexible so we could add on it and expand on that solution for the future? Now, in terms of, you know, working with that's like standardizing that across the board, it is hard because in different countries, obviously you have different factors that play in, whether it's the languages or, you know, having to, maybe one group uses video conferencing and other people don't. So it's gathering all that information up front, using the metrics to understand the support and what's needed in those different regions, and kind of building it from there and standardizing if possible for globally. So then, you know, if you're coming to our headquarters in Irvine, you're using the same technology as if you were over in our European offices. So it's not something that's going to confuse you when you walk into the room, like, am I going to know how to use this? Because at the end of the day, the end user just wants to be able to go in, connect, and go on with their meeting. They're not trying to go through a whole process of steps and meticulous, you know, all reasons to try to get the stuff to work. So.
And hey, I want to chime in and ask Dana a question. So Dana, how often do you collect that data? Because I think that's very key.
So in terms of the collecting data piece, we're also trying to build in solutions that can collect that data, where we can manage the systems remotely so it can connect us to those metrics. So right now it's a manual process, which is very difficult, whether it's using our ticketing system within how we put our support request in, or working directly with the team, and we have to go into the calendar manually and, you know, process and analyze all that data. And also, you know, logging into the systems and seeing how many calls dropped, or, you know, what wasn't working. So it's pretty much done quarterly at this point because it is a manual process, but we're hoping to build in with the technology and the networking standpoint where you can log in remotely and collect that data. And the system is actually a smarter system where it's working for you. So it's helping us because we're only one person. I can only physically be in one room at a time. Whereas if I have a system that is tracking all this information that for me, then I can go into the logs and take a look at it and review it with the team, and we can easily pull that information up. So.
And also another question. So with the data that you're obtaining quarterly, do you also do periodical surveys? Because one of the things, going back to what Michael said, is yes, you know, methodologies change within a workforce, but so does the workforce. And that's one of the things I try to convey to the clients. You know, there's a lot of clients that traditionally do things over and over and they collect the data, but they are not realizing their workforce has changed. You have different types of workers coming in who are more smart device workers who don't need to use a conference room. So do you all do surveys periodically to get feedback and assess that and understand that type of workforce that's coming in, new talent that the organization may be, you know, recruiting?
We do try it. We definitely try to, on the IT AV support aspect, I know they send out the surveys to see, you know, how is your overall experience with teams, for example, like rolling out teams. We had different ways of collecting information and surveying our employees and seeing how was your overall experience. You know, do you like the call? How was the call? You know, was it the system user friendly? And then in terms of sending it out company-wide, it's kind of just meeting with those stakeholders. It's kind of like whether it's the administrative services team, you know, since they're the ones that normally have to go book the meetings and support them and get them set up, we'll survey them directly. So, because sometimes it's hard to get access to the end users as a whole, and we do try to, you know, be smart about the way that we're getting this information from our employees. So just working with those shared services teams or support teams.
Charmaine brought up a really good point, and this was something that I had kind of on my list as something maybe we could all talk about. You know, we talk about user experience and technology from kind of a functional standpoint, as far as, you know, are we able to be productive in our meetings and those things? And that's one bar of a user experience. Do you think that user experience and that technology in general can play a part in how people perceive your company and its culture? And, you know, is tech sometimes an amenity, or is it used as an amenity in a space to give somebody something extra that maybe they can't get from one of your competitors? Michael, have you seen that in Convene?
It is absolutely an amenity and like an accoutrement to the greater space. But at the same time, we have these great food offerings and great space, and it looks amazing. But if the tech doesn't function, their productivity will dip ultimately, right? So while it is like an amenity, it is sort of a core tenet of what most enterprises need to accomplish their goals and their work. So I just to tie back to something Dana said, and I know I'm derailing a hair here, but she talked about like consistent experience across, like my European experience is the same as like my American office experience. And I sort of challenge that ideology and that thought of like, why does it have to be exactly the same across such like a large dearth of geography? Like I understand within like a building or multiple floors, but, you know, I think I saw in the comments here, like, you know, some specific users in specific rooms need a specific experience, and depending on the market and the workforce and the teams that are located there, that experience can change and shift. So it's sort of like back to the stakeholders and like who needs to be involved and sort of that larger conversation. I don't know if I have the answer to it, but it sort of seems like the list could be infinite of who you have to touch base with.
So let's talk about that for a second then. So the word consistency, and sometimes I get caught up in semantics, so maybe I'll try to differentiate here. Does consistency have to mean the same, or does consistency mean that it has some core features that are very similar, so that we always have good internet service, we always have HD cameras, we always have microphones that have good audio, we always make sure the space is tuned well, as opposed to we always have, you know, XYZ brand in a room with this touch panel with the button in the right-hand corner? Can there be regional differences, but the consistency of the experience is the same, although the back-end way that you're facilitating it or the actual user interface may differ based on the geography or the culture of the person actually using it?
Yeah, I would say it varies and changes, right? Because you're going to learn lessons and you're going to change. So I'm assuming if you're sort of this massive global enterprise and you have the opportunity to vary the user experience, you're going to learn things. And again, it ties back to kind of lessons learned and incorporating that into your future feedback and utilization. So I think, Mark, you got a great point. It's sort of the core what are the core tenets and the non-negotiables that have to exist inside your enterprise? And then what on top of that is really good, bad, or indifferent, and it's just sort of use case specific.
Charmaine, Verrex is global, and you guys are doing a lot of global managed services with clients. How are you managing that expectation of a consistent experience while still having to deal with, you know, maybe even things like, you know, certain products aren't available in certain regions, so don't you have to boil this down to kind of some basic tenets and then figure out what's available in the region that would make that happen?
Yeah, you basically, you know, have to boil it down to basically the regional aspects of the client you're dealing with, right? So it's not always a one size fits all. Rachel Harris from American Express wrote this blog also, where she said AV is made to measure. And I love that phrase that she used. It's the truest thing, you know. Some people think it's just, okay, we can consistently it's one thing, copy, cut, paste, and we're good. It's not. So it is made to measure. And the way we manage it through managed services at Verrex is we are constantly, it's a process of being consistent in the frequency of your engagement. That's the best answer I could say. So it's not enough just to implement the solution and then, okay, we'll fix it when it breaks. We have to consistently engage with the customer to do a review of, okay, this is what we've seen happen in the last quarter with your service. This is what we feel the need is. What are you doing differently? We're doing this, we're doing that. Gather that data, go forward, continue. Next quarter, revisit it again. You know, it's a frequency that has to be consistent. in and understanding that particular enterprise and what they're doing differently in each region, what's available, and also a frequency in what we know knowledge-wise as to what's coming up for that technology in APAC, in Europe, in Latin America. You know, Latin America, depending on where you're integrating in Latin America, it's not the same as doing an integration job in the US. It's very different. Some AV vendors based here in the States believe, oh yeah, it's similar. Absolutely not. So you have to make sure you rely on a good, in addition to doing that consistent, frequent engagement, follow-up, and process. Also make sure you have a backup. So good partners within each region that help support you, because it's a team effort. AV is a team sport. Another quote from Rachel Harris in her latest blog. I enjoyed her blog too, and I follow her. Just had to say it.
Dana, I'm going to push to you just for a second, only because I have specific knowledge that you're tackling a project in South America or just finished one of the two. You may still be highly active in it. What's one of the biggest challenges of working across regions like that?
Well, similar to what Charmaine said, I mean, there are limitations with what's available in each region. And so figuring out who the best AV integrator is and to work with on that project that fits within our requirements and can meet our needs, and also support the systems after we do the full installation. That's a huge thing for us, is the support aspect of it. Like whether it's our support agreements that we have in place, understanding like, hey, when we put this system in, we want it to work, but we understand that issues are going to happen, but we can't have the system down for that long. So making sure that, you know, one right now, especially during COVID times, because there's a lot of other elements that you can't predict that keep you from physically visiting the site. Whereas normally we would take a tour down there, go physically visit the site, speak to the stakeholders in person. Now everything's being done over the phone or through Teams meetings. So it's different hurdles that you have to, you know, basically get over and overcome. And it's just staying kind of in touch with those stakeholders, letting them know that you're there with them every step of the way. And then once the job is done and that solution fits within our main standard, you know, items, but at the same time, it's what's available in the region, then we know, okay, this is the best solution, this worked, and we can successfully implement it and have it go in. So. Yeah.
So one theme has emerged over and over again, and this wasn't a question on my list, but I'm going to throw it out there, and I'm going to start with Sean. Given the nature of audio video and many of the companies out there that haven't consistently been in the managed services or kind of support field, you know, we have a contingent of our industry that's very project based. But one of the themes I heard here for consistent and good user experience is number one, early communication, which I think we all have a challenge getting to the right stakeholders early, but also this consistent touch and this kind of iterative cycle of feedback, right? The deploy, implement, adopt, assess, tweak, redeploy, and over and over and over again. How as a consultant, where maybe it seems like, you know, your part of the project is this one piece in the beginning, how are you how are you creating that consistency of communication throughout a project with the customer where that iterative cycle gets done and the user experience lives and breathes and moves with the customer and isn't like a one and done?
For me personally, how I do that is make sure that I have a clear chain of communication. Who am I directly reporting to? Who am I directly feeding information to? And any extraneous communication outside of that needs to cease. We've all seen projects where there's too many cooks in the kitchen and most of them could leave. And as a consultant whose time is being billed usually at an hourly rate, or, you know, over a certain rate, I have to start billing. I always make it very clear up front, like, my time's costing you money. So make sure whoever's feeding me information has the correct and relative information, and that they communicate with me directly, and don't bring too many extraneous people in, or if they do, have them feed it to that person and to me. Keeping the lines of communication succinct is very, very important. Then also taking it a step further for yourself as the engineer or the consultant or the programmer, because programmers, oftentimes our consultants are sitting there real time making scriptural changes, that you understand what's within your limits to achieve. I'm not saying that, how can I put this in another word? Know what you're willing to put out. Someone might approach you with a project, you say, yeah, I can do that. And then halfway through you realize they wanted Mount Everest, now they're asking for the moon. You might be able to deliver the moon, but you're saying, I'm not doing it. That's not what I was hired to do, and you keep them on Earth. That is setting realistic expectations for yourself and for the client are key to that maintaining consistency. Because if you keep letting the client push you on these little things, eventually you will have, as we all probably experienced, this long list of change orders that are unpaid that you're still fighting over months, years later, that are unnecessary because expectations weren't established. That's just establishing some clear rules of communication and expectation for me are very important to maintaining some standards. And for me, I draw a line in the sand. If I see a line crossed more than 3 times, I had a client recently, which I said, we're not working together anymore. Sorry, we can't. You're going to cost yourself money and me frustration that I don't want to deal with. So it's time for us to go our separate ways. And that's fine. I mean, that takes a certain amount of chutzpah, but sometimes chutzpah is what you need in this industry. So that's an important thing for sure. Just setting those expectations and sticking to them. Don't let yourself get caught into a corner, pushed around, and always be polite, be professional. And when those fail, be willing to walk away.
Yeah, I would say, to play a little devil's advocate on that, I would say that if you have proper communication up front and you've established a level of trust, that most of those things can be established in the beginning. And I'm sure that's what you try to do, Sean, as you work with customers. And most of the time, those situations arise because there's something that the customer doesn't want to share, or some trust that you haven't established for them to share that in order to get that. I'm a big fan of, the customer. I like to sell the customer what they think they bought.
Right.
And if I haven't communicated properly what that actually is, then I see a lot of that as an integrator myself, I see a lot of that as my failure to communicate properly or to establish the proper expectations at the beginning of the job. Saying, well, we wrote down a 98-inch TV and now we want a 140-inch. Now those things are fairly clear, but a lot of the ambiguity of the user experience, well, I thought it was going to be automated in this way, become things that if we don't have that level of communication, openness, and trust in the beginning, that conversation doesn't happen the right way. And I kind of side with the customer on some of those as well. Charmaine, when you're talking to customers and developing these relationships, what do you think, I guess, what do you think the key is to establishing a relationship that leads to this process of being an integral part of a living, breathing user experience over time?
What's key to that? Well, I think the key thing, in addition to, not just engaging properly and communicating, but we also have to realize AV is a teachable moment for users. We have to be willing to teach them. And what I mean by that is, yeah, we know, I had a manager, an executive once in an AV company says, okay, Charmaine, you implemented this for this customer and they told you this is not working great and this is great. And you say it's wonderful. Who's right? Who's wrong? Is it you? I said, I don't know if it's a question of right or wrong. I said, the fact of the matter is, I know more about the technology than the customer because I live and breathe it every day. I can't expect them to live and breathe it every day. That's not their job. So because I live and breathe it every day, I have to make sure that if I'm recommending something based on what I believe and what I, got from the communications we had beforehand, that if we don't sync, I educate them and show them what I know. And it's okay to do that. It's okay to be on the path of being teachable to your users. They need that. They like that. They respect that. They rely on it. So you have to be willing to really be willing. Demos are a way to do it, bringing them in, showing them, some of the best sales executives I've ever worked with in IT or AV are very huge on doing demonstrations and showing them the product and doing proof of concepts and making it teachable and educational for that user. I think that's a very big key because when you go in, again, the workers change, you have different type of workers coming in, different skill sets with technology and experiences. Not everyone knows the same thing. They only know what they know. So you have to make sure you're making AV teachable. It has to be, in some aspect, there's moments where it has to be teachable to the user. And that way you're all, evolving together for a long-term relationship. They go to you, they trust you. They're like, you know what, she taught me that. I didn't know that. Oh, let me go back and see what else she can show me. And, I want to do this, but I don't know. That's how you do it. It has to also be teachable.
Yeah, and I think, they're going into the Q&A and going into something here that I always talk about is that, many times we design something and we teach users how we think that they should use it, but we're not really paying any homage to what they already know how to do and what they like to do. Everybody has some type of experience with technology that's sitting in their pocket, that's sitting on their desk at home, and especially over the last 3-4 months. And those things create expectations and habits and all of those things. Michael, when you're thinking about designing, again, for this space, how do you achieve empathy with your potential clients? I mean, what type of things do you really look for to leverage the momentum of the user experience when somebody's coming into a space like that?
Yeah, I mean, on our meetings and events side, we tend to make it a little bit more white glove, so the customers don't have to worry about it, right? They're paying a premium to be in a space for 8 to 9 hours. They have an objective to hit, and they don't need technology to interfere. They need it to enable. So that user experience is geared toward to the operator, right? And what can they do to perform complex functions fairly quickly that are unobtrusive to the customer. But in the meeting room and where the customer is interacting, it definitely gets a lot harder. Because I think for us, it's again, it ties back to, like, we have such a varied customer base. So there's no one silver bullet here that fixes the UX problem for us. We have to sort of create a level or generalized playing field where, again, keep it simple, because simple should satiate a majority of use cases, but still be robust enough that if anyone is outside of the majority of those use cases, that they can also interact with it. I just saw a 1 minute left thing, so I don't want to take up all the time here.
Yeah. I want to end with Dana because of where we're at and in the conversation. Dana, if you had 2-3 tips for somebody in achieving that kind of empathy and designing a good user experience for your people, what are kind of the 3 main lessons you've learned over the last years doing that?
Communication with the key stakeholders. That's number one. Basically, lessons learned for me is kind of looking at past projects, what hurdles we faced then and how we overcame them, and seeing how we can make sure we don't face those again. So communication, making sure it's a simplified solution, simple across the board, simple to support, simple to use, simple to integrate. And then also number 3 would basically just be understanding the culture of whichever company you're designing for, or who your end user or client is. So knowing that it could change, knowing that needs change on a constant basis. So having something that's flexible and fits their needs.
That's awesome. And with that, I want to respect everybody's time. If you haven't been listening and understood the need as technology people to have a better understanding of soft skills, needs analysis, and communication, then you probably missed this whole panel. Your kids must have been yelling in the background or something like that. But I appreciate all of you guys joining me, Michael, Dana, Charmaine, and Sean. Thanks so much for coming and doing this. I'm sure we could talk all day on how to do this. And I encourage people to reach out to you and connect on LinkedIn and social channels.
Thanks so much, Juan.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, it's
Thank
Navi.
you.
Hey everyone, it's Navi from the AVIT events team. I just wanted to take a quick moment as we're about to go into our networking break to remind you all as attendees to visit the conference hub and make sure you check out our Passport to Prizes. Simply click on this tab, Passport to Prizes, and you'll see all the great prizes that our sponsors have offered up. There's still time left to enter. You'll see a leaderboard to the left of the top 50 that have the most engagement on our site. There's still time there. We'll be announcing winners in the auditorium at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time. So on that note, I'll let you guys get to networking and visiting our sponsor booths, and we'll see you all again at 2:15 for our next session titled The Future of AV, What's Next? Thanks for joining.